This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Josam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us tonight Professor Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure to have you with us tonight. We have a lot of things we've discussed and different cabbages and kings, different events in the world. But one of the things that's happened recently is it appears the executive agreement involving Iran is going through.
Yes.
And that seems to be an issue of enormous complexity and complications. And this involves the way that treaties are propagated in the United States, and this seems to be not a formal treaty. Maybe we could parse that out a little bit and explain the difference between a treaty and this executive agreement, as I understand it.
Yes. Well, a treaty is fairly straightforward. It's an international law document binding between two or more states, and the Constitution has a requirement that the Senate has to approve treaties. And the president is the one who negotiates them, or somebody in the State Department, someone under the president's control, actually does the negotiating. But for purposes of American law, it does not become binding until the Senate has approved it. And presidents eventually got tired of having to deal with that. As a matter of fact, the Constitution requires, the technical language is the advice and consent of the Senate, not just that the Senate rubber stamps it and says yes, but the original understanding seemed to be that the Senate, which was a very small body at that point, only 26 people originally, would actually serve as a cabinet or an advisory body to the president. And George Washington actually attempted to use it as such, and it was a crash and burn.
Yes.
And at that point, the president quit seeking the Senate's advice and eventually started negotiating agreements that essentially had the force of treaties, but weren't treaties in that he never submitted them for Senate approval. And now there are a great many executive agreements that essentially serve as treaties. They are pretty much as binding, but they just circumvent the Senate requirement.
Well, now, really, if you look at the relations with foreign countries, the whole arrangements, pretty much the executive has seized control of that, has he not? I mean, I'm trying to think about, I don't know, let's say we're going to do some kind of arrangement with China to import this or export that, or the economic arrangements, or we're going to, pursuant to that, we'll take 25,000 people in your country can come here or not come here, or we're going to give you assistance. We're going to do this or we're going to do that. And it pretty much, the president has enormous leeway in doing these things.
Yes, the president has always had a practical advantage in that he is a single voice and that he is always there in Washington. There was a time, believe it or not, when Congress only met for a few months out of the year.
Yes.
And of course the president is the ultimate boss of the State Department, which is the Department of Foreign Affairs. So that gives him a tactical advantage in day-to-day supervision and direction of foreign policy. And of course, as we got more and more involved in the world, that became a bigger and bigger deal. And in the 1930s, in the Curtis Wright case, the Supreme Court actually formally said that the president is the, if you will, the official foreign policy voice, the official foreign policy organ of the government. So that just reinforced a pattern that had developed over time.
Now this is rather, so in a way, if I understand this, the President Obama, if he wished, could just do anything he wanted to in regards to Iran. I mean, I think the fact the Senate has relatively little power over this. It's been said recently he secured 34 votes, meaning I guess it's veto proof. Yes. But he could really, does this really have to go through at all? I think there's some kind of arcane senatorial rule that made even a vote possible. But if he wanted to not a mesh Congress in this, he could maybe just do it independently.
Yes, well, in this case, I think Congress had passed a law saying that we're going to supervise this, and if we don't like it, then we can overrule it. But of course, if Congress is acting as if it's a regular law, the president can also veto that law. And in order to override a presidential veto, you would need a 2/3 vote in each house, and of course 2/3 would be 67 in the Senate.
Yes.
So once Obama has got 34 senators on his side of whatever party,
Yes.
Then he can't be overridden. And so that's what that magic 34 that.
And this is a rather temporary arrangement. I mean, the next president can do as they wish, is my understanding about that. They do whatever they'd like. And it's a really complicated, massive document, I think. And this is what happens many times when the American people try and judge what is in a particular law or document. It's just about impossible.
Yes, and we live in a soundbite world too, so just trying to understand what are in these.
And so people say, they look at this document and they say, well, there's no verifications, there's this, there's that, this is wrong with it, that's wrong with it. But understanding all of the nuances of that is just very difficult.
Yes.
The Republicans all, however, every one of them voted against this. That's pretty impressive, isn't it?
Well, it is impressive, but it's also typical of the direction that we've been heading in for the past several years as we just get more and more partisan. And you have seen a great deal of party discipline among the Republicans during the Obama presidency, and it's availed them nothing.
Yes.
That they were incredibly united against the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare,
Yes.
and we still got Obamacare. They have become very united against this. It's still going to go through. A few Democrats would break ranks. Of course, in this case,
Yes.
You had some big names that broke ranks, but even that is not going to. Schumer, for instance, is probably
Yes.
the biggest name,
Yes.
but I imagine he will change his vote now. I don't know, but we will see.
Well,
what
people
happens
do
there.
deals too. I mean, in
Yes.
other words, I've heard it said that people are under political pressure. Well, I know it's going to pass anyway, so it's shake hand, wink, wink with the president. I'm really for you, but
Yes.
that political pressure, I'm going to just vote against it. It won't matter,
Yes.
and I'll get some political cover by
Yes.
doing that.
Well, Bismarck, one should never watch legislation or sausages
Yes.
being made
Yeah,
if he has a
that's-
weak
that's
stomach. So,
right. Well, some of the issues out there, I mean, we can get into sort of a broader discussion about the proliferation of nuclear weapons. It's a rather daunting arrangement. The number of countries with nuclear weapons, and particularly it's disturbing to see North Korea having nuclear weapons, which
Yes.
seems to be a done deal that nobody cares much about.
Yes.
No one is attempting to do anything to North
Yes.
Korea right now in regards to that. No one is going to attack North Korea, and they're seen to be very nutty. I mean, as nutty as anyone, and they seem to be just get away with it, I guess.
Yes. Well, as long as they keep themselves to themselves, I suppose. You let sleeping dogs lie. It's when they wake up and bite that you have a problem. And of course, North Korea loves to rattle the saber, but in terms of major actions, so far they haven't really done anything. But the problem that you're dealing with nuclear proliferation, excuse me. I once wrote an article making fun of Jimmy Carter's pronunciation, and that's ruined my own pronunciation of that.
Oh, there you go.
The Amy speech, when he asked Amy what he thought the big problem was, and she said, Amy, of course, being 13 years old, said, "Daddy, I think the worst problem today is nuclear proliferation."
Yes.
Which,
Right.
and so that's wrong
I see.
pronunciation.
Yes.
But the problem with it is you're dealing with basic facts of science.
Yes.
And these basic facts are known by any competent nuclear physicist.
Yes.
I mean, I know the basic facts
Sure.
of how to build at least a fission weapon. The only problem is me getting hold of about 50 pounds of uranium-235. That's the tricky part. And that even cannot be controlled a great deal for that matter. There's so much uranium in the world that give someone enough centrifuges or enough time, they can get it.
I guess what one could say about this is that we have the 9/11 event. If people really want to do something dastardly,
Yes.
to use Franklin Delano Roosevelt's word, you can do it. I mean, you can do whatever. You can do something awful. Obtaining fissionable material seems to be the where everything is trying to stop that from taking place. But you raise the issue. Is this an obtainable thing? When the Soviet Union cracked up, is there substances like that out there? Could you get something from Pakistan, or could you get something from North Korea? Is there a black market in that? I mean, or you could even produce a dirty bomb,
yes.
which could do terrible damage. You can
Indeed.
just get the so there are lots and lots of possibilities for evil,
Yes.
and particularly in the Middle East.
Yes. Well, also you like to think that, well, people who are smart enough to be able to build nuclear weapons will be smart enough to safeguard them. But that is just so wrong. You would think that of all countries in the world, the United States, rich, powerful,
Yes.
advanced industrial complex, that we would know how to safeguard nuclear weapons. But not so long ago, it came out that when Strategic Air Command and the ICBM Command had permissive action links in place to prevent unauthorized launches, they had very long strings of numbers in order to speed things up and make sure that they could retaliate quickly, especially if Washington were taken out. They just set the combinations all to 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, just completely nullifying.
Yes.
So if we're doing that, then what about a cash-strapped former Soviet republic with
Yes.
some small tactical munitions over here that can be put in a backpack and carried around?
Yes.
It's terrifying.
So just to sort of making the point there, if there was a really heinous group of people in Tehran that really wanted to just do something awful, they were just crazy, there'd be many ways they could do that without producing the fissionable material. But so, you know, that's quite a subject to go there. But isn't this the bigger deal? This is in regards to what's happening with Iran, is that their assets have been frozen, and they're going to get a huge amount of billions of dollars will come to them because that's their money too.
Yes.
It's like, it's not as if we're going to give them money. We've taken their money, we've held it, and now they can get it back, and they can also start to sell their petroleum on the open market. So maybe that whole story about nuclear weapons, I mean, I'm not dismissing it, but I would say another big issue is the fact that Iran is going to get all of this money, and is that going to, the two facts together, is that going to destabilize things? Suddenly getting $150 billion and then be able to sell the market, things on the open market. Is that a destabilizing fact to make Iran powerful like that?
Yes. Well, I would hope that, as we were saying in an earlier conversation, empty stomachs make people angry.
Yes.
I would hope that if it does anything, it would stabilize things. That
Yes.
if you inject money into an economy, you get a bigger middle class, you get more stability, you turn away from any religious fanaticism that may exist and more towards worldly creature comforts. It's sort of modern day opium, if you will. That we can only hope that it will have a beneficial result on the stability of Iranian society. On the other hand, maybe it just means more money for them to invest in a covert weapons program,
Yes.
or buy materials from someone who is desperate to sell their inventory. Just hard to tell.
Well, it's the same argument, I think, for Cuba, that President Obama said, well, we're going to open relations, that we'll put them in the capitalist nexus, that things will be great. The argument against that might be that Cuba's been open to the Europeans for a long time, and to many ways, Iran has its opening, at least some connections.
Yes.
And it hasn't been a magic bullet to turn things around. Though, I think we have to say that in general, I take your point, that if you're traveling, you're trading, you're watching Western television, you have the internet, it does promote a broader viewpoint. It should, I'd put
Well,
it
it's
that
a
way.
two-edged
Now, whether
sword,
it does, and the question, or having said that, is and we get into sort of this complicated geopolitical thing that's probably past my keen to talk about, but we'll make an effort. The complexities of the Middle East political situation, the Shia, the Sunnis, the ancient Persian Empire, the Arab, the watershed there, the delicacy of the Persian Gulf. I mean, it turns out that other countries may respond to this. That just letting Iran do this may cause a lot of instability. I wonder if anyone knows what's going to happen to them. Does anyone have any judgment on what's going to happen?
There are many imponderables, and there are multiple causes. We were talking earlier about this. There are so many different variables in this that you don't know how things are going to play out. And maybe the same money that would lead to greater stability in Iran leads Iran to be, in the eyes of some of its enemies, a greater threat, or its regional enemies, and so it could have an internationally destabilizing event. I think that's what you're
So just to continue with that, I mean, I guess what I'm getting into is how should an American citizen, how should they come down on that? What should our government do or not do? Presumably, this executive agreement is going through against the will of Congress, if you wanted to say that. I mean, obviously, if you took an up or down vote on it, there's not going to be a minority position on this. And if you look at the polls, I think most people would say, no, we don't want to do that. On the other hand, there could be an argument, and there is an argument, to say that bring Iran into the world, they'll cool it a lot, they'll be more relaxed. Plenty of people, if they wanted to do something terrible, they could do it now. Another argument is that the power of the U.S. to affect the world might not be as much as we think it is. The other countries that are involved here, as I understand it, no matter what we do, they're going to sort of open the doors for Iran, and that's the Europeans. The Russians have already done that. And it's our opposition is not going to be it'll be a nuisance, but still the situation will change, and if we accepted it, we could get along. If we didn't, it'll be a problem.
It's a modern version of the great game that was fought in the Middle East for a great deal of the 1800s. It's very interesting, an example of how things, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I don't know if you've watched the new BBC production of Sherlock. Which
occasionally,
yes, it places Sherlock Holmes in the 20th century.
Occasionally, I've seen that. Yeah.
Well, in the original Holmesian canon, it was at A Study in Scarlet, that when Holmes and Watson meet for the first time, Holmes takes just a quick look at Watson and says, "You've been in Afghanistan, I see."
Yes.
And of course, Watson had been as an Army doctor.
Right.
Well, in I think 2010 or 2011, when the modern day Holmes meets the modern day Watson, Holmes takes one look at him and says, "Iraq or Afghanistan?" And of course, here we are, 150 years later. The British are still there. We're still there.
Yes, the great game continues.
Yes.
Well, just to get into that, I mean, so Americans have very little knowledge of what's up. We have this complicated thing we don't know, and we talked a little bit about, I guess we'll just brushed up against causality as to what happens, and it's so difficult to prophesy about things like this. And there are algorithms on each side. You could say, this is what's going to happen. These people are crazy. They'll use this. They'll attack Israel. There'll be a nuclear war. They'll kill 1 million people or 1 billion people. They're just waiting to cut throats. The other argument is, well, these guys are, they're really pretty cool. Give them a chance. Put them in the deal. It'll work out fine. And who would? So it sort of comes down to the judgment of the political process in Iran, and I'm just clueless as to what one could say about that.
Yes, I know there are Iranian specialists out there, but I guess we are not they. I do get the sense that there is still some vestigial anger that came out of the late 70s and the whole hostage crisis. But on the other hand, that is increasingly long time ago. You've now got a new generation coming on, a young generation.
Right.
A lot of them are very urbane.
Sure.
But it doesn't take many fanatics, and every country's got its fanatics. We've got ours, and the question is, will this somehow empower them?
Right.
So.
Well, it's just the Iranian situation is very complicated, and I think it's worth saying that the Persian culture is very ancient, their country is very ancient and powerful, and one could make the case that the Roman Empire cracked up by a war with the Iranians, beat the Roman emperor, and then it took all their money, and the Persia is equal to the Roman Empire.
Yes.
It's this tremendous place. Their history is great. They've had all this 3,000 years of history. They're certainly mentioned in the Bible substantially.
And much older than the Romans. It was, the Persians were really the first true great world empire.
They've had this tremendous history, and then you could say, like many sort of, I guess you'd say third world countries, or close to third world countries, maybe second world, but they found themselves just out of touch with the 20th century, and they became sort of a quasi-colony. And I think in World War II, the British and the Russians partitioned the country. They had, and the idea was, I think in 1953, the Iranians were going to have their own country. They were going to nationalize the Persian Gulf oil wells, and then a sort of a CIA coup occurred,
Yes.
and the Iranians were very angry about that. And the Shah that was put in under the auspices of the West to counteract the Russians was a bad guy, and there was a lot of he did terrible things to his own people. I think that's a fair statement. And so some of what happened in the hostage crisis was referable to that story.
Yes.
And there are all sorts of other nuances to it that are hard to get into, but at least that's a fair statement. If you look on that side, their side of the street, that they feel like it's their privilege and right as a great people and country to be equal to anyone, and et cetera.
Yes, and you mentioned a problem that that is something that it's not limited to that. That during the Cold War, we made a lot of enemies, and we didn't worry about that too much, even when we understood that's what we were doing, because we were engaged in what we thought of was a struggle for our existence against a much bigger, much more imminent threat. And so I think if you had asked someone like Truman or Eisenhower, because the Iranian thing was one of the opening chapters, they would say, well, we're just going to have to let the 21st century take care of itself. Right now we're trying to preserve the United States. But we sowed bad blood in Iran, in Korea, in Vietnam, and in a way, Osama bin Laden was our own creation in fighting the Soviets. So.
Well, you know, I think I'm reminded of if I can remember this rather clever statement that Winston Churchill made when the British and the Western world had done everything they could to I guess, injure the Soviet Union in 1919, 1918. They were bad guys. They did everything possible to give them a nip, and they were enemies, class enemies, national enemies. And then when Hitler attacked, they became an ally, and someone asked Winston Churchill, well, you know, how can you possibly ally yourselves with the Soviets? And he responded, well, if Hitler would attack the devil, I would at least, if I can understand this, I would at least make a favorable reference to Satan and the House of Parliament. I do that.
It's very similar. If Hitler were to invade hell, I should at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of
That's right. I think that's a better thing. You did it better, right? It's a better. But nevertheless, the idea from national politics, you have to do whatever you have to do to win the world, if you say that. And you could make the case that the West and people would say the capitalist West, though we would prefer the democratic West, had done these things just to stop the Soviets from moving as they were certainly capable of doing, moving to the Persian Gulf and going after that oil. I mean, it's certainly a geopolitical issue there. Well, I mean, we're getting into this story now. Another question to ask about this is our ally Israel and their viewpoint on this. So there's it's a delicate subject, but in general, the Israelis are at least a substantial, not everybody, but a substantial group of people, Netanyahu, et cetera, believe this is a existentialist threat to Israel. They're anticipating some nuclear attack.
Yes.
I mean, that's what they think. I mean, I think.
Yes, and well, certainly there's a lot of talk, and it's probably hyperbole, but probably is not certainly. And you can't blame Israel for having a bunker mentality. I mean, they are absolutely ringed by at least potential deadly enemies, and that is really what drove the recreation of the modern state of Israel. That's what drove Israel to acquire atomic weapons. That is what has driven Israel to use its military might unilaterally on occasion. So I think that they are, in terms of will, fully capable of taking on the Iranians one-on-one, even without any help from Washington or anyone else. And I imagine that they're already working up contingency plans. Now,
Well,
technically, do they
yes.
have the capability to carry out that far strike? That's a question.
So another part of this algorithm, if you're trying to decide what's the right thing to do, is if the Israelis believe this is an existential attack, I mean, are they going to do something like they have nuclear weapons.
Indeed.
I mean, they do. They have nuclear weapons. And that's a long story as to how they obtain those nuclear weapons, which it's not time to get into. But they've got a lot of nuclear weapons, and if they thought that they were in jeopardy, presumably they would do whatever it took to prevent that. And if they were paranoid enough and didn't trust the system enough, then you could imagine they would do whatever, and that would include nuclear weapons, I would say. And the whole world would implode then. And so how much of a card is that in this complicated story here?
Well, I would say I would not think that Israel would act precipitously. I don't think that's the right term. I think they're very capable, both in terms of their military forces, their intelligent forces. I would put the Israeli Defense Force and Mossad, the intelligence agency, up against really anybody on Earth. I think that if they had a realistic belief that the balloon was about to go up, they absolutely would not hesitate. So preemptive strike is no problem for them. So my hope is that they would not act in panic mode. I don't see the Israelis doing something like that.
So we get into this communication issue or understanding or whatever about what each country is doing. And a real question is, I mean, I tried to make the case that if the Iranians really wanted to do something, there are lots of ways that they would do it. This is a strange way for them to do it. I mean, if they really were just desperate to injure Israel. But presumably if they went through, they were going to do this, there'd be some kind of time to prevent it from happening. But this is something that could happen anywhere. The other thing about this is that it's been said that the animosity between the Persians, the Shia Persians, and the Sunnis is greater, I've heard this asserted, greater than the Jewish people and Israel and the Iranians. And the target would be maybe ISIS, or they would blow ISIS up, or they would do this, or they would do that if they wanted to do something. And the Sunnis would be more their enemies than the Israeli people. I've heard that said. And so you get into the question of maybe the Sunni states there would feel threatened, and they would want to get their own nuclear weapons, and you'd get another complexity in this terrible situation there.
Yes, I think we're coming to a good summary here, that you're dealing with a very large area that is very diverse in many ways in terms of religion, if not ethnicity. And everybody's got his own bone to pick, everybody's got his own axe to grind. It is not a wealthy region of the world for the most part. I mean, the Saudis, for instance, have plenty of money, but
less than before, yes.
So, but most of it has a very poor standard of living. It's not particularly democratic. And so there are a lot of pressures here. You have a lot of different groups who have issues with each other. And if you want to inject a nuclear arms race into it, it's not going to improve the situation whatsoever.
Yes. And finally, I'll say this. The other thing about the arrangements there is the democratic system has its virtues in many countries, I would say that. And some countries, it's a rather shaky situation, and one can imagine sort of a faux democracy where tyrant just inflamed people with one thing or another and then provoked war in order to secure its position. I think that's a well-known event going back to Aristotle and looking at certainly the Greek philosophers thought about tyrants and how that played itself out. And the hatreds are so extraordinary there. Almost anything could happen. And one has to be sympathetic, I think, with Israel. It is a tough neighborhood. If there's ever an understatement, that's it. And it's a very dangerous situation for the world.
You can't blame them.
One can hope that the President Obama and his advisors have done the correct thing here. One can hope that, and we'll just have to wait for developments. The fact that it's been sort of pushed through is troublesome.
Yes.
But that seems to be what's happened.
We will have to wait and see.
Well, all right, Bucky. Thank you for being here. Thanks for not good interchange here.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.